Hi, this is the first of a series of discussions on education, which is quite a substantial subject matter, so it's going to take several installments to cover the amount of material you would see in one written paper. It's becoming necessary for writers to go this route because almost no anti-academic literature ever makes it to print, and meanwhile the issues and sources become outdated. There are also things you can do in this format that writing can't. My experiences as a student are difficult for some people to hear because of the loyalty they feel toward that institution. I don't consider it something necessary in my life. There was a time when I was able to compete against academics in the workplace and win because I knew more than them. But now, opinions like exercising the right to apply, or in an interview scrutiny goes both ways, have disappeared. They have no place because they are punished wherever they are spoken. I've noticed that some of my peers are now educational administrators who are unable to communicate the same basic concerns that have existed since they were students themselves. So here is an introduction to the anti-academic doctrine. There is a void within the educational world against which all academia is embattled. You can see them engaging in this fight and preparing their positions every day until it becomes so commonplace it loses our attention. We see it on television, in public gatherings, and in private conversation. Faculty are always exceeding their duty by bringing the cause to new fronts, prolonging their words beyond redundancy to ensure they hit the mark. We are called to invest in education by time-garnished institutions, dubious pseudo-institutions, and people who profit nothing, all speaking with one voice, sharing their personal crusades like volunteer militia trying to prove themselves. Every pageant and sporting event is a thinly disguised academic promotional as thousands of soldiers advance onto the field. Vast resources are sacrificed to aid this campaign, and yet, despite the overwhelming majority under its command, these offensives are needed on a constant basis within its most sheltered halls just to keep academia from coming apart. So, with all the political and social might at its disposal, why then is this country's dominant education provider so dangerously close to defeat? Who or what is its adversary? At times they seem only engaged against each other. But in what political battle or debate have we seen a non-academic citizen declare victory or even make an appearance? Who benefits if it were to collapse? And how will we know this person when he appears? Academicians themselves believe their opponent is ignorance, because in their view they are the source of all knowledge. Therefore, ignorance could be whatever they say it is. One day it might be private competition, another it's an unruly student, perhaps a teacher with a dissenting opinion. Here are some possible reasons as to why an institution must struggle so constantly to maintain itself on all fronts. 1. Students don't want to be there. In a forced practice, it's hard to address scholastic issues when there are difficulties like survival, abuse, neglect, and suicide, the same issues a prison has. For those people, education isn't a pleasant experience. A school is not a happy family of educators. If someone reacts physically when something is forced on them, it's not because they aren't hungry for learning. That's a misdiagnosis. If this is the case, its enemy is desire, without which learning is not possible. 2, its merits have no value, either in the present job market, economic situation, or locality. Have you ever noticed the less a product is needed, the more it is advertised? An overabundance of job applicants leads employers to take extreme measures of screening, not necessarily out of preference or any kind of wisdom. If this leads someone to make a life decision by enrolling at great cost to them, is it the same as actually confronting the challenges of underemployment, economy, and overpopulation they are faced with? Or is recruitment something static, the pursuit of profit, in which case the enemy of academics is worth? 3, its standards don't match actual intelligence, integrity, or work ethic, or the information presented doesn't match what the student knows is necessary to his life, or contradicts that experience. In this case, the enemy is truth, without which people are unequipped to make decisions, unless those decisions are all in the service of the provider. If a more knowledgeable student receives lower marks than a student who better represents the masses, let's say because of a teacher's personal partiality, should that student forget what he knows and give up the personal accomplishments that will be useful in the workforce to better his chances in this simulated environment? 4, voters don't like the institution, or wouldn't if they were better informed, in which case the enemy of academics is choice. The institution stands because it is in a district where its continuance is not a public decision, or no alternatives are to be found. In extreme cases, where schools are being closed down, causing outrage by the public fighting to keep them open, it's only the school board itself that is unwanted. Discussion of these issues rarely ends well. Conflicting loyalties lead everyone to give arguments like, the investment is more important than ever in these economic times because higher credentials are needed to compete, which does nothing to address the absurdity of applicants with college degrees competing for a bookshelving position at the library, or empower the applicant to pursue any path of his own choosing. At best, these only tip the scales and inconvenience someone else. Everyone seems to know a collegiate who has enrolled in good faith only to hit a proverbial brick wall, i.e. that a year of hard work is no longer sufficient toward their goal, who doesn't figure, if the water tastes bad, stop drinking from the well. They just go back for more, indefinitely. If dropping out is a necessity, they do it quietly, with shame. Online universities that have fallen into controversy are criticized privately, but no one cites the similarities between their commercials and those produced by the most accredited institutions giving the same spiel. When a county employee is arrested and charged with abusing a child, saying extreme behavior calls for extreme measures, no one recalls the superintendent of schools or other time-honored disciplinarians saying the same thing. The arguments don't go all the way to where they need to be, which is simply the ability to call something what it is without fear of rebuke. Or perhaps people just don't know what to say. An anti-academic doctrine is an unspoken enigma some would say doesn't exist, because anything critical of the academic method is silenced and branded as unbeneficial to society. In response to this is an exploration of this philosophy and how it applies to every part of the educational spectrum, requiring only a willingness to understand the basic tenets that lead to educational independence, civics, candidacy, and finally, legislation. The war between academia and alternative education has also not been documented enough to equip the educational soldier. No two educators agree, and this is not required to explore this path, as education comes in 1,000 forms and speaks with 1,000 voices. Academicians will be offended by this disloyalty to the company store to which they have spent a lifetime of capitulation. But a citizen can overcome, as he is entitled to do in all democratic enterprises. And when this war is over, the student who has been abandoned by every stage of the academic process will finally see an end to whatever keeps him from a life of his choosing, to the point where he is no longer labeled a student at all. Here is such a doctrine. Let it be resolved that if an American citizen can be called an educator, he or she must adhere to every requirement and civility of that title. That if he or she sees a failure to educate in the form of neglect, corruption, or misuse, they will take action to identify the problem and promote its end. For teaching to be an ethical profession, they must be compelled to do so. A lack of education must be viewed as a disease harmful to the future of society. In other words, if someone in class is not learning, this person ceases to be an educator and no longer has any reason for being there or moral authority over them. If what I just read doesn't apply to circumstances the school is oblivious to, as well as those it knows about, how true is it? Let it be resolved that if any child, youth, or adult in this country can be called a student, this identity must be consistent with a promise to educate, not the presumption of education. If its assigned providers fail to deliver, the consequences are as real for the student as if a contract has been breached. It is imperative that every future citizen receives treatment which they can one day employ themselves through the events they will help transpire. If a student is defined as someone who is learning, then I am more of a student now than I was when I was enrolled. Allow legislation to pass that if a place of learning can be called a public school, it must be public monitored and public sanctioned, taking responsibility for all forms of education at its own expense, without corporate and political motives. And treat this institution not to confine any part of the learning experience, but expose itself to all judgment, acknowledging the world and not itself as the source of education. Require it to educate foremost on the subject of its own dealings, relinquishing the keys of education into the hands of parents and students. Promote a new breed of citizen who is empowered by knowledge, not seeking to implicitly trust an institution, but make demands of it that earn its continuance. Enable him to make the best decisions to educate both his progeny and himself. Let education be discovered and respected in its purest form wherever it occurs, revealing every secret and subtle thing that hinders it. A true educator must then be frustrated with this scenario if it be the truth. that the public school system and its many subsidiaries has failed in its task so many times, destroyed so many lives, while others are forced to spend a majority of their existence shunted through a process in which loyalty will make them leaders and lawmakers who perpetuate this same system for another generation. That in doing so, it has attained unmatched political standing in our society for its own benefit. That it employs people in great number who do not comprehend the adolescent mind and are amateur in their attempts to deal with it. That its customers are non-entities, regardless of achievement, with neither a voice with which to cry out nor a champion to respond, because there is no incentive for a politician who represents people without the right to vote. An educator must therefore resolve to become this advocate, or turn a blind eye that requires a complete lack of regard at the sight of injustice, or hypocrisy if that person continues, to their own advantage, to be called a benefactor of young people. Whoever chooses to answer this call will have to overcome the incredible buffer that now exists in the public mind between what education is supposed to be and the form it has actually taken. For example, education is something that only exists in the student's brain. It is not a GPA or a test score. It's invisible. And education doesn't come from an institution, nor is it something that can be stopped. The reason street gangs will always exist in the inner city environment is because in that environment math can't compete when it comes to their survival right now. For academicians to admit this would require acknowledging that the student's world outside of school is their reality. Prevention is misconstruing what education is. The very language we use is tainted with school-supportive vocabulary. Decent education, academic integrity, etc. The entire school system is based on certain myths which the intelligent person does not truly believe, such as students with higher grades are smarter than students with lower grades, and the teacher is always right, the student is always wrong. Something is needed to help the citizen muddle through this shroud to see what is really going on and draw their own conclusions. The consequences our society bears from simple actions within the classroom will be explained in the coming sections, and an alternative solution will be presented in each case. New definitions will be presented for terms such as teacher, student, and new bearing on what constitutes an ideal student, learning environment, and the role of a state education program. That it should be modeled in the likeness of our democracy, held to the same standards as business, etc. Likewise, the relationship between teacher and student should be based on that of fraternity, with neither dominance nor pretension taking a seat. That they would dream of a better institution and help pave the road leading to its debut. Thank you for listening. My next chapter, The Education Revolution, will be coming shortly. I'm interested in feedback, especially from educators, because I believe it helps my arguments. Email might be better than the comments section. I will read the best ones in a future installment and either respond or concede to them.